Someone called Heronymous Levi has requested that I talk about the superego. Anybody who's read an introductory book on psychology will know that Freud divided our psychology into three parts: the id, the superego, and the ego. Now, the id, as you can see it on the diagram, hopefully, is what we're born with. It's our primary drivers: the survival instinct, the sexual drive, the drive to procreate, the drive for power. It's what you might call the animal instincts. And because that is largely a wild beast in actual fact, it isn't really all that suitable for placement in society in its raw state, because it requires instant gratification. If it's hungry, it wants to eat now. If it wants sex now. It has no notion of delayed gratification. You know, if you look at a small child, if it doesn't get food when it wants it, it just screams. Simple as that. So this is the id, these primary, unrefined drivers that are in actual fact our most real part. The problem is that these parts are to a large extent unconscious. We're not really aware of this beast that is driving everything within us. There are some interesting psychological experiments that have been carried out that show how easy it is to actually release this beast. The classic one, and I've mentioned it many times, is the Stanford Prison Experiment, where two groups of students were given two roles. One were to be wardens or prison officers, and the others were to be prisoners. And after a few days, the wardens or the officers were abusing the prisoners. Now you have to remember, these were just ordinary students given roles, but given a little bit of leeway, given a little bit of authority, and the beast starts to crawl out of its shell, or escapes its repression, because that's basically what we have to do in life. We have to repress this thing. Now, what does the repressing? Well, both the ego and the superego do the repressing. So the superego is effectively your conditioned self, and it's said that the superego is more or less conditioned by the time you're 5 years old. So you learn what is acceptable in society, what isn't acceptable, what is wrong, what is right, what will get reward, what brings punishment, and so on. And the superego is sort of like an image that we have of ourselves. So very often I speak to people who, and this is one of my favorites, but people who say that they are loving, caring people. Well, nobody's a loving, caring person all the time. Everybody gets angry, everybody gets hateful, all of these things. So to say that you're a loving, caring person is really just some kind of expression of this self-image, some kind of model of what was acceptable and got approval when you was young. So, are you a good girl? Yes, I'm a good girl. Are you a good boy? Oh, bad boy for, stealing Johnny's little toy truck or whatever. So the ego, the superego, is this conditioned thing that has learned what is right and what is wrong. And the superego is naturally in conflict with the id, because the id wants Johnny's little toy truck. It wants it now. But actually, the superego says, no, that's Johnny's. You've been told that it's wrong to steal Johnny's toy truck. And so there's conflict. And we then come to the ego, which is, in a sense, the most conscious part of us, because a large part of the superego is also unconscious. And so the ego concerns itself with things like planning and reason and delayed gratification. So the ego says to itself, this is how I have to behave in this world to get what I want. So it plans and it schemes and it does whatever it can to get what's needed. This also is obviously in conflict with the id, our primary drivers, because the id wants everything now. And it's also in conflict with the superego, because the ego may say to itself, well, the quickest way for me to get rich is actually to go and steal that money from great Aunt Gertrude. And it may reason that out, but then the superego comes in and says, no, you're a kind, loving person, you don't do that kind of thing. So the human psyche is just this boiling brew of conflicts. So how do we deal with all of this? Well, Freud actually said that most of the superego, and certainly the id, are unconscious, subconscious. And Gurdjieff famously said that our real consciousness is our subconsciousness. You know, on the top, we put a nice veneer. When we meet people, we smile and say nice things to them and try to be charming and pleasant, and all the time underneath there is this slightly crazy beast that's dying to get out. And that's really what's operating us all the time. So put people in a slightly contentious situation at work, say. Will somebody sabotage somebody else's efforts if they're trying to get a promotion? Well, yeah, very often they will. And you see people, for example, who go and work in munitions factories, or are working on chemical weapons. There's a place called Aldermaston in the UK. Perfectly nice people go and work in there. And they do it because society has said that it's actually okay for them to work on weapons that are likely to give possibly millions of people a truly awful death. And their ego is planning out their retirement and all that kind of thing. And behind that, of course, is the id, which is basically saying you need to survive, take the job, get the money. And so these things, drivers, they produce conflict and so on. Now, that's a conventional view on all these things. In my own opinion, it complicates matters. I think the model is useful. And by the way, I'm not a psychologist, but my wife is, and is a member of the British Psychological Society, and so I get to get a fairly good briefing from her, and some interesting things. But anyway, so I think it's fairly well known that Freud got his inspiration, or a lot of his inspiration, from Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer is the man, as far as I'm concerned, because Schopenhauer identified that every living creature is driven by this thing called the will to live. It's a blind force. It's as blind as gravity or electrical forces. It's just something that living creatures have within them, and if they didn't have it within them, they'd become extinct. And so it's almost like a self-selecting thing anyway. So we all have this will to live, and this will to live means that if you have to disadvantage somebody else to get what you want, then you will do that. Now, of course, there are things like the superego and the ego, but they are essentially conditioning. The ego is really conditioning. The ego just learns that we have to plan to achieve things, and we have to delay our gratification, and we have to think about things and apply reason. But compared with the id, the superego and the ego are just astonishingly weak. That's why when you get into intense situations like an invading army, then rape, murder, pillage. The most awful things happen, and the people who do this were once upon a time just ordinary guys walking down the street. But in that kind of situation, there are no constraints upon these people, and so the id just goes crazy. Anyway, to get back to Schopenhauer, this idea of the will to live is a driving thing for Spinoza. And this is really a direct, sorry, not for Spinoza, for Schopenhauer. And this will to live is really the real part of us. We can pretend that we're not animals, but basically we are. And we put all kinds of societal layers on top of that to try and make ourselves look respectable, and so on and so forth. But in reality, we are this will to live, and it's a blind force, and it means that every living creature believes that it is the center of the universe, and that it has the right to survive above and beyond everything else. And it views its own death with horror, and yet it can hear of the death of 1,000 people in a different country, and it not even particularly register. So, we start to get confusions of terms now, because in Buddhism maybe, and certainly in the Gurdjieff work, ego is seen as our self-interest, if you like. Personally, I don't see it as that. I see that as the id, or the will to live, or the, I've called it the wolf in other videos. This is the primary driver. Everything else is just conditioning. And everything, so the distinction between ego and superego for me, isn't particularly useful. We've basically got our primary state, how we're born, and then we've got conditioning. And the conditioning is what causes us pain, because it's in conflict with the id, or the will to live. And so we need to be honest and look at what is really driving us. How many people can do that? Almost no one. Gurdjieff said, a man just cannot look at himself without all kinds of fancy embellishments on his personality. He cannot look at himself and see that basically he's just an animal that will exploit others and possibly even murder, and certainly steal, to ensure his or her survival. So, talking about Schopenhauer, I just want to actually read a short extract from him. It's from his main work, which is called The World as Will and Representation. And he says, however, he will be least afraid of becoming nothing in death who has recognized that he is already nothing now, and who consequently no longer takes any interest in his individual phenomenon, since in him knowledge has, so to speak, burnt up and consumed the will, so that there is no longer any will, any keen desire for individual existence left in him. That's such a profound statement. I would suggest that if you get a few days spare sometimes, or at some point in time, read the chapter called On the Doctrine of the Denial of the Will to Live in The World as Will and Representation by Schopenhauer. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. Anyway, to go back to that piece that I just quoted, what Schopenhauer is saying there is that this will to live creates within us monstrous behaviors and is the cause of an awful lot of suffering. So the way to come to some understanding, some kind of strategy, if you like, to deal with this is to understand what's going on, to be honest. And this is why people who deny anger and greed and envy and derision and lust, an old-fashioned word, but lust, and so on, will never ever be able to understand themselves, because that's really at the bottom of it, what we are. And so Schopenhauer says here that a man who has enough knowledge of himself, and you could use the word understanding, knowledge or understanding, has enough knowledge or understanding of himself, burns up this will to survive as an individual entity. And obviously that's a very big thing. Very few people would achieve that. But if you remember the Buddhist monk who set fire to himself because of he was protesting about the Vietnamese War, then you'll see that that is indeed possible. That man was obviously not all that bothered about his own existence. And in fact, even Spinoza says things like, a man should accept death, or a man of reason should accept death, rather than tell a lie, which is a fairly extreme thing. And very few people achieve that. Now I'm just looking for another quote from Spinoza, because there's a very beautiful thing that he said. Here we go. He that knows himself to be upright does not fear death, and shrinks from no punishment. His mind is not wrung with remorse for any disgraceful deed. He holds that death in a good cause is no punishment, but an honour, and that death for freedom is glory. And that's in chapter 20 of the Tractatus Theologico-Politica, or however it's pronounced. So there are plenty of people saying that we can overcome this self-centered drive that is called the id. But it requires total honesty. And it requires that we do examine what we call our ego and superego. In other words, our conditioning. And in Gurdjieff's words, we need to destroy the buffers, the things that mean that we can never see that we are total bastards at times. You know, if we have this idea that we are kind and loving people, then we're never going to be able to see. Our consciousness will not allow us to see that we've just treated someone in a truly despicable way. So that's my take on the whole thing. And I shall finish by just reading this bit from Schopenhauer again, because it's very profound. If you get some time, read this part of the world of as will and representation. However, he will be least afraid of becoming nothing in death who has recognized that he is already nothing now, and who consequently no longer takes any interest in his individual phenomenon, since in him knowledge has, so to speak, burnt up and consumed the will, so that there is no longer any will, any keen desire for individual existence left in him. Amen.